Good afternoon, distinguished guests, fellow presenters, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the invitation to contribute to this important symposium being held to mark the 20th anniversary of the UN intervention in East Timor. I certainly welcome the opportunity to do so and to talk about just some aspects of the extensive, unprecedented diplomatic effort that secured the intervention. Some elements of this effort are well known and have already been referred to in earlier presentations. The shuttle diplomacy, the high-level meetings, the letters, the phone calls involving prime ministers, presidents, foreign ministers, senior officials from Canberra, and the lobbying of leaders at the fortuitously timed APEC summit in Auckland in September, where security issues and the unravelling situation in East Timor simply overtook the customary trade and economic issues. They've also been well documented, these high-level interactions, and well recorded for history, the subject of many analyses, as for example in David Connery's book, which I note isn't in the bibliography, Crisis Policy Making, Australia and the East Timor Crisis of 1999, put out by the ANU Press in 2010. I'll just give you a glimpse of one of those high-level visits. This is a well-known figure in New York on one of the lobbying and flying visits, being shepherded by myself. So there was this big, high-level world of diplomacy and diplomatic interactions happening constantly. Considerably less known, thought about and discussed have been the activities undertaken at UN headquarters in New York. The diplomacy that was conducted there by Australia, by other countries, and by the UN Secretariat that played a decisive role in delivering the Security Council Resolution 1264, the one that authorised the intervention. In part, attention hasn't been given to that because some of those activities at the time were conducted in secret or were very deliberately low-key. Knowledge of them held within an extremely small circle. And in part, it's because, to my perception, other than in specialised academic circles, certain NGOs and areas of government departments that deal with UN agencies or handle issues on the UN agenda, there is less interest here in Australia, in the UN, less awareness of the way it works and the way it can be used for our benefit than in most other countries. There is a tendency in the public domain to focus on the UN's deficiencies rather than its capabilities, on its shortcomings rather than its successes. And in government, there's a greater interest in bilateral and regional diplomacy than overall in multilateral diplomacy. As a diplomat whose career spanned all three areas, bilateral postings in the Pacific, Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Americas, policy work on regional organisations and issues, and who spent 7 years as Australia's ambassador to the UN, 3 in Geneva and 4 in New York, I simply say that's a pity, a wasted opportunity. All of those aspects of diplomacy are important, and they can be complementary and reinforcing, as we saw vividly when managing the East Timor crisis. where the work in bilateral posts, the representations, the lobbying, the collection and delivery of information and intelligence, the advice from capitals, providing assessments and judgments about country positions or possible positions, fed vital information to the nerve centres that were operating in Canberra and in New York. There are skills and capabilities, diplomatic tradecraft, I'd call it, common to all of those areas, but in a multilateral context, those of communication, representation and negotiation and language skills obviously have added profile and importance. And in the case of the UN, which most people would acknowledge as a complex, challenging environment, there's an additional specialised requirement, not only to become good at trying to get, at the time I was there, 189 member states, now 193 member states, to agree on a position, but there's a need to master its complex rules, practices and procedures. If we are genuinely in the business of drawing lessons from management of the East Timor crisis, of what worked, why, what delivered success, then one is the importance of having Australian personnel with a good understanding of the UN, of how it works and can be worked. This isn't something necessarily easily or quickly acquired. It's better built over years, as in my own case, through exposure to UN meetings and international negotiations. At the Australian mission in the UN in 1999, we had those capabilities and we drew on them extensively. Just as Peter, you said in a news interview this week about the intervention anniversary that you were proud of your troops and what they did in East Timor, so as Ambassador I was very proud of my small team and the significant contribution that it made to the overall Australian diplomatic effort. But I venture to suggest that today in Australia we don't have enough people with those skills and experience. There's a need, and we've been talking about capability development all day. There is a need to build Australian professional capability and expertise to operate effectively with the UN, to deal with an ever-expanding agenda of global challenges and threats, to be positioned effectively to influence the process when push comes to shove, to be operation ready to respond to future crises, and we've anticipated the likelihood of those today in our region and beyond. And here, absolutely, I want to emphasise that I'm speaking not only of our diplomats, our diplomatic service, those people who you think sometimes, Peter, have glib patter, but I'm talking government-wide. We've just had a wonderful example of the AFP's long history of engagement with UN operations and international activities. But we need to deepen and strengthen that sort of experience across departments and agencies and in our armed forces. But in a way I'm jumping the gun a bit talking about lessons learned. I suppose that should have been at the end. I want to come back now to the historic Security Council resolution that authorised the intervention, and specifically as requested by the Symposium organisers, tell you something more about the UN diplomacy that enabled its adoption in the early hours of the morning of the 15th of September 1999. And I'll just skip ahead a bit. That moment in the Security Council chamber, when 15 hands, and if you look carefully, you'll see they're all up, were raised in unanimous approval of Resolution 1264 was simply unforgettable. Certainly one of the highest points of my 40-year career as a diplomat. It represented an enormous achievement for Australia and Australian diplomacy, and also something of a if not a breakthrough, then certainly a very significant success for multilateral diplomacy and for the UN. Now, this mightn't be necessary for this well-informed audience, but just as a reminder, the Security Council is the only body of the 6 main UN organs with the power to issue binding resolutions, legally binding resolutions to member states. It's got 5 permanent members, the famous, not the famous 5, the famous P5, the UK, France, the US, China, and the Russian Federation, and 10 non-permanent members elected on a regional basis for a 2-year term by the General Assembly. At the time of the East Timor crisis, Australia was not a non-permanent member. We were outside the privileged and powerful inner circle of decision makers, making the task for Australia of securing Security Council agreement considerably harder. Before the actual vote, right up to the last moment, and let me just find this. This is my copy of the draft resolution, and I've got scribbled across it, adopted unanimously at 02:16. But what we were looking for, what we wanted, and it was a big, big ask, was Council approval for the establishment of a multinational force. We wanted that force to be led by Australia, and there were plenty of people in the lead up, and as we were drafting that resolution, who were working, supposedly supporting us, but who were working very vigorously to stop that happening. We wanted, in UN speak, a Chapter 7 mandate. Again, for the uninitiated, Chapter 7 of the UN Charter deals with threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression. It spells out the measures that the Council can authorise to maintain or restore international peace and security. These include measures not involving the use of armed force, so sanctions or the severance of diplomatic relations, but also the use of force, military operations which can involve air, sea or land forces of members of the UN. Security Council mandates for UN peacekeeping and peace-making operations involving the use of force have varied enormously. We talked about today being in the shadow of Vietnam. So too, as we were working on this, we were in the shadow of Kosovo and Srebrenica. And that, in a way, helped us. In the case of East Timor, it was clear that we needed a robust mandate, and we got it. We got it for some of the reasons that we've been hearing and seeing, in particular the session that we've had on UNIMED, in particular that constant feed of messages from the courageous media that we heard about and images that were being projected all around Australia and coming to us in New York. The force was authorised to take all necessary measures to fulfil its mandate, including the use of lethal weapons, the right to shoot, the right to protect civilians under imminent threat of physical violence. You've heard something already from other speakers about aspects of Australia's role, of the steps leading up to the intervention, about some of the high-profile politics, bilateral and regional diplomacy, and let me just give you another glimpse of some of the things in the early hours of that morning. Here's Mr. Downer, who played a strong role and came to New York many times, addressing the Security Council, covered in the New York Times, me addressing the Security Council. It was a pretty constant effort. But Peter Cosgrove today talked to about the behind-the-scenes stuff. And I want to take you a little bit behind the scenes, tell you something about the quiet diplomacy I talked about earlier, about the work of the core group. For a long time after the intervention, Very little was said or written about this group. I did speak about it publicly in February 2000 in a speech I gave in Sydney at the Glover Cottages for the UNAA and the Institute of International Affairs on East Timor and the UN, but I didn't identify its members. At that time, I explained that from the moment the ballot process began, Australia worked closely with a small group of other countries with a very close interest in East Timor. This group, which is on the model of an established UN mechanism, sometimes called groups of friends of the Secretary-General, was very carefully composed and kept deliberately small. Deliberately, it included Security Council members as well as non-members, all of whom were committed to the success of the East Timor process. The group worked in very close partnership with the UN Secretariat, and it operated strategically, meeting on a daily basis throughout the crisis period. We were in constant contact 24 hours a day, sharing information, developing ideas, coordinating representations to others, formulating strategies to address current and looming problems. We also worked in the closest of contact with our respective capitals, all of which had established East Timor task forces or policy coordination groups, and above all with our respective embassies in Jakarta. Since those public comments by me in 2000, more information has been published about the core group, most notably in 3 publications. They're not on your bibliography list, and maybe they're not the best bedtime reading, although I found them absorbing, but I commend to you all 3. One, it's a really interesting read. It's a memoir published in 2003 by Ambassador Jamshid Marka, the UNSG Special Representative for East Timor. East Timor, a memoir of the negotiations for independence. Then there was a book published in 2007, Friends Indeed, ? The UN, Groups of Friends and the Resolution of Conflict by Teresa Whitfield, in which she includes a case study on the East Timor core group. And then there's an article published in 2016 in the Australian Journal of International Affairs by Jeremy Farrell and Jochen Prantl called Leveraging Diplomatic Power and Influence on the Security Council, the Case of Australia, where the work of the core group was seen as a means of Australia exercising a high degree of influence on UNSC decision-making without being on the Council, and an example of Australia using effectively its diplomatic capacity, creativity and connections to that end. As a member of the core group, intimately involved with its formation and its operations, not all the information in these publications is fully accurate, but much of it is. The members of the core group, it's now been revealed, were Australia, the US, the UK, New Zealand and Japan. The Secretariat described that as an ideal mixture of very vested and very benevolent forces. Each of us had our own ideas, no doubt, as to why we were there, and our governments also. But the UN Secretariat, and the UN Secretariat is sometimes called, and for good reason, the 6th permanent member of the Security Council, certainly had very definite and clear views on the who and the why. Some very revealing comments were made by the Secretariat, revealing also to me, as a member of the core group, about the way in which the Secretariat acted to help this group be put together. The composition of the core group, and I'm quoting now, was carefully balanced. It responded to a variety of needs, all of which would be facilitated by its small size. These included the coordination of international efforts behind a UN lead, information sharing as the political process advanced, political leverage, particularly over Indonesia, and logistical and financial support, which we haven't touched on much, through a trust fund established for this purpose. Australia's inclusion my own inclusion was certain. I was in regular contact with the Secretary-General and Ambassador Marker, and I had their confidence. And I also, because I'd been there for, about a year, had established relationships with the key players, my PR counterparts, in particular the Chinese, the P5 members on the Security Council, and the Chinese and Russian connections became very important because we were very worried about the possibility of vetoes through that period. Our mission was at the time also working extremely closely with the Secretariat, but its agenda in setting up the core group, it's now been revealed, was somewhat different from our own. And I think it's worth sharing and asking, was it a coincidence that the idea took hold and the group was formed just at the same time when Australia was talking about forming a larger support group? I don't think it was a coincidence. For the UN, these were the considerations it took into account. A group without Australia was clearly inconceivable. Its close links with Indonesia, long history on East Timor, geographic position, Timor-Leste, Ambassador, I'm still back 20 years, and ample resources, and remember this is the Secretariat's view of us, to support a UN operation placed it in a unique position. Moreover, it had much at stake in a positive outcome. Although UN officials, and again I'm quoting Secretariat sources, would come to consider that Australia was playing a Jekyll and Hyde role with respect to its relations with Indonesia, they knew that Australia's close cooperation would be essential to any success. The US also was an absolutely inevitable choice. It wasn't just Dick Holbrook's activism, it was for all the reasons that we know about in terms of US power and influence in the international community. Japan's inclusion was very interesting. Japan doesn't say much. It's usually a fairly quiet member in international negotiations, but it was the largest donor to Indonesia, and despite economic troubles of its own, it had been deeply involved in efforts to help Indonesia through its financial crisis. We've touched on that earlier. It really was a very key part of the context points that have been referred to throughout today. Although, and something else really important, although Japan's constitution included strict provisions preventing its military from participating in PKOs, Japan had signalled to the UN, including early in 1999, that it was eager for an enhanced engagement with the United Nations in peace and security, and it had signalled its willingness to provide substantial financial support for any UN operations in East Timor. The Secretariat was also counting on Japan's presence to offer reassurance to Indonesia and Indonesia's supporters on the Security Council, and to bring some balance to an otherwise overwhelmingly Anglophone membership. The inclusion of New Zealand and UK was also a little curious to some, but clearly a matter of strategic utility. New Zealand, in the view of the UN Secretariat, brought regional perspective, combined with sympathy for the East Timor cause, and the Secretariat believed that that could, and I quote, provide a useful foil to its larger and more powerful neighbour, Australia. The UK was certainly considered by some a surprising choice. They had no obvious interest in the East Timor issue. They hadn't sought an active role, but the Secretariat thought that the UK would be well placed to pilot consideration of the resolution through the Security Council, not least because its remove from the issue would give it greater impartiality. And they were absolutely spot on. from my perspective, the UK's experience as a permanent member of the Security Council was invaluable, enormously helpful when we moved into drafting presidential statements and resolutions. And something else, and some of you may be aware of this, the British took their core group responsibilities elsewhere, with their ambassador to Indonesia coordinating parallel meetings of the group in Jakarta. So even though it was a UN New York focused group, it had its offspring and parallels elsewhere. Once it was established, the group worked extremely well, active over many months, operating at several levels, drawing on professional resources in our respective missions. The ambassadors at one level, their deputies, and drafting committees. And throughout, it maintained the strictest confidence, sometimes to the annoyance of other colleagues. I remember the Canadian ambassador in particular, who was a member of the Security Council, smarted at, and Canadians are very involved with peacekeeping things, smarted at Canada's non-inclusion. And when I refused to discuss the draft Security Council resolution with him on 14th of September, and that date's significant, sent me an absolutely stinging handwritten note about not honouring the spirit of CAN's cooperation. That hurt because we are faithful CAN's members, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but it absolutely had to be. The stakes were too high and things were so uncertain right to the end. The work of the core group was a fundamental element of the UN diplomacy that delivered Security Council agreement for the intervention. I wanted to talk about it at this symposium because it's a story not known to many people, and I think it offers some important insights into the way the Secretariat works and the way the Secretary-General himself worked. Quiet diplomacy was absolutely his forte. Kofi Annan's hand was everywhere. He was a consummate diplomat and leader who, from the time he assumed the office of Secretary-General in January 1997, and Ambassador Guterres would know this well, had signalled his personal and active commitment to a solution of the East Timor problem. And as the events of 99 played out, he intensified that commitment. The East Timor intervention is widely acclaimed as a success. And success always has many parents. But, and we've heard about archangels today, but in any consideration of the UN and the diplomatic context that I was particularly asked to talk about, nobody could gainsay the critical role played by the Secretary-General himself. For those who haven't read it, and I just draw your attention to one more. The chapter on East Timor and on the East Timor intervention in his own memoir, published in 2012, Interventions, A Life in War and Peace, is absolutely compelling reading, but it's also eloquent testimony to his deep personal engagement and contribution to the international community's response to the East Timor crisis. His leadership and decisiveness at critical moments was outstanding, but there were others too who took bold and decisive steps to move things in the right direction towards that final vote in the Security Council and those 15 hands raised in approval of the binding resolution authorising the intervention. There's no time now to go into details, but two such actions in the frame of UN diplomacy, and more specifically of Security Council diplomacy, was the resurrection, at the suggestion of the Secretariat, of a device which hadn't been used for many years by the Council, the sending of a small mission of Security Council members to see for themselves what was happening on the ground, to assess the situation at first hand. And the second thing was the holding of an open debate in the Council on the 11th of September. I've paid public tribute before, and I do so again, to the absolute courage, and we talked about, what are those words? Courage, commitment of good men, to the then President of the Security Council, Netherlands Ambassador Peter van Walsum, for insisting against very substantial resistance, and this was the way we worked the whole time, dealing with the resistance and getting a bit further along and a bit further along, but he insisted on going ahead with what turned into a 7-hour debate in which 51 countries participated, including us, of course, on a Saturday. That debate sent an unmistakable message to Indonesia. The fact that the Indonesian government accepted the offer of a multinational security force the next day, on the 12th of September, was proof positive of its worth and its impact. And similarly, the Council mission had a big impact, galvanising the Council into action. Several members of the mission were deeply affected by what we've heard and seen, and by what they heard and saw, the evidence of the wholesale destruction. And their personal observations clearly influenced the view of other Council members who had been wavering and reluctant to support, above all, a robust resolution giving us that Chapter 7 mandate. From our perspective, when that mission returned to New York, its report to the Security Council overcame that lingering resistance to the passage of a strong resolution. Van Walsum has actually talked about, given a speech, and there's an interview online which I tracked down, about the interventions of 1999, Kosovo and East Timor, from his experience on the Council. In the case of East Timor, he's got a somewhat different take on what contributed to the final outcome, what did the trick, what tipped the balance. And he attached considerable weight to President Clinton's announcement on September the 11th of the suspension of all US Indonesian military assistance programs, underlining yet again the many forces that were in play and the many pressures being brought to bear in New York and elsewhere. Ladies and gentlemen, for those who don't know the UN and the challenges of multilateral diplomacy well, how difficult it is to get not 193 but 15 members of the Security Council to agree on a course of action. I just wanted to give you a glimpse into some of the possibilities. As for the lessons learned, from a diplomatic perspective, dealing with the East Timor crisis enabled us to test in a practical way, very practical way, many ways of working and their effectiveness. Some of those things, quiet diplomacy, formation of a core group, open debates, proved their worth, as did leadership, individual capability and commitment, and could readily be replicated in other situations. But my final comment, consistent with my earlier point, is that part of the legacy of the East Timor intervention should be a recognition of the benefits that close Australia-UN cooperation can deliver when important national interests are at stake, and a willingness to commit more effort, more national effort, to building Australian knowledge and capability in the conduct of multilateral diplomacy and working with the UN. Thank you for your attention.
Penny, just one quick question before I ask the group to join me in thanking you. There's one country you haven't mentioned, Portugal.
Portugal was a complication. That's
our headline for tomorrow.
No. We obviously it wanted to be deeply involved, and above all, I think that Ambassador Marker and Kofi Annan did a great deal working with Portugal. We obviously worked extremely closely with Ambassador Monteiro, who subsequently became Portugal's foreign minister, Same thing with Lavrov for the Russians. But they needed to be persuaded to step back a bit in a number of ways. But they felt very strongly that they had been a lone voice, as they put it, defending the interests of East Timor for a long time. And maybe they also had a recognition of their own legacy of the colonial era, which had contributed to some of the problems that we all witnessed. But they were engaged, they were active, but they needed the most careful management and to be kept a little bit at arm's length. One way we pulled them in was to get them working on the Lusophone connection, to get them, because they wanted to put their own troops in to protect their mission. And they were dissuaded not to do that when we were in the middle of trying to get the MFN up. But we suggested, as we were trying to put the force together, that they could use their influence with, for example, Mozambique, Brazil, and that's exactly where we ended up. So they contributed, but it was nevertheless quite a complex play.
Would you please join with me in thanking Penny for a terrific presentation?